to this plenary session of the European Humanitarian Forum. How to improve compliance with humanitarian law, international humanitarian law. How to fight this sense of impunity that we're seeing on our TV screens today, and not just in Ukraine. So there's a sense of urgency here, and what is very important during this plenary session is to hear the collective voices of ministers, of commissioners, of the civil society, and international institutions together in a call for action. Today we heard, during the forum, we heard a number of debates, and one that really hit me, there were many, right? But the one today, one of them today on famine, where we have the Deputy Director of UNICEF, Karen Hulshoff, saying this is a toxic moment because we have multiple crises and we're slipping back on the progress that we made. How do we address that now? So I'm burning up my time because everyone that's going to speak is limited to just a matter of minutes. We will try to do this as best we can. And let me give you a couple of tech tips. First of all, this is, of course, being live streamed. Hello, everyone who are not here in the hallway, and we hope that many have joined. We do know that. And it will be on video on demand later. Hashtag European Humanitarian Reform. I sent that out on hashtag European Humanitarian Reform, the one that I heard about at the toxic moment. We hope that many of you can cast wider the words that you hear now during this hour. So it is a race against time. And at this point, then, I think I would like to call up our two speakers. I guess one at a time we're going to do this, right? First of all, though, but they both of these gentlemen went together to the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2020 in the depths of the COVID crisis. And they went there with 3 planes full of 40 tons of humanitarian aid and about 100 different NGO workers, people, to address the COVID situation. And that wasn't the last time they went together either. I would first like to give the floor à Jean-Yves Le Drian, ministre de l'Europe et des Affaires étrangères de la France, qui représente aussi la présidence française. Monsieur Le Drian, s'il vous plaît.
Monsieur le commissaire, cher Yannès, mesdames et messieurs les ministres, chers amis, je veux tout d'abord vous remercier toutes et tous d'avoir répondu présent à l'invitation de la présidence française et de la Commission européenne. Et je veux vous souhaiter la bienvenue à ce tout premier Forum humanitaire européen. Notre Europe, qui, institution européenne et États membres réunis, est le premier bailleur international, est incontestablement une puissance humanitaire. Mais il faut qu'elle en prenne conscience et qu'elle agisse en conséquence. Cela nous donne bien sûr des leviers pour peser dans la vie internationale, nous devons en être conscients, mais cela aussi nous donne des responsabilités majeures que nous devons assumer. Et c'est le sens de cette rencontre que nous avons souhaité ouvrir aux acteurs humanitaires du monde entier et qui a vocation à devenir un rendez-vous international régulier. Cette première édition était d'autant plus nécessaire qu'une tragédie humanitaire d'une ampleur et d'une gravité historique se joue aujourd'hui sur notre continent, en Ukraine. En Ukraine, où la guerre d'invasion lancée par la Russie a déjà jeté près de 3,5 millions de personnes sur les routes de l'exode, sans compter les déplacés internes.
Je vais vous mettre le micro là.
Ça va pas?
C'est comme ça.
Ça va mieux.
Très bien.
sans compter les déplacés internes qui sont plus de 6 millions. En Ukraine, où les habitants des villes assiégées par l'armée russe vivent dans la peur et les privations, en Ukraine où l'ensemble de la population civile est aujourd'hui exposée à la menace des pires exactions. La guerre de Vladimir Poutine, nous le savons tous, met aussi en péril les systèmes alimentaires de nos partenaires du Sud, en Afrique, au Moyen-Orient et ailleurs. Et faute de cessez-le-feu, faute de trêve agricole, nous allons au-devant d'une véritable crise alimentaire mondiale dont la Russie portera seule l'entière responsabilité. Crise d'autant plus forte qu'elle s'inscrit dans un contexte où l'insécurité alimentaire est déjà très présente, au Sahel par exemple, mais aussi ailleurs, au Yémen notamment. Et alors que plus de 800 millions de personnes souffrent aujourd'hui déjà d'insécurité alimentaire, de faim ou de malnutrition, la FAO nous indique que l'actuelle crise en Ukraine pourrait exposer plus de 10 millions de personnes supplémentaires à cette insécurité alimentaire. Bien sûr, l'Europe est et sera au rendez-vous pour faire face à ces bouleversements comme elle fait face à l'ensemble des grands défis humanitaires où l'urgence climatique et le contre-coup de la crise pandémique ont conduit à une explosion sans précédent des besoins sur tous les continents. Mon pays, la France, prend sa part à cet effort collectif. Nous avons triplé le volume de nos financements humanitaires. Mais en Européens, nous nous sommes donné les moyens de mieux coordonner nos actions à travers le mécanisme européen de protection civile, dont l'efficacité n'est plus à démontrer et qui montre toute sa valeur dans la crise ukrainienne. Et je pense que nous devons aller plus loin en mettant en place une capacité européenne de réponse aux crises humanitaires qui complétera l'action des États membres en les articulant mieux pour un impact plus fort, en exploitant les synergies et en mettant à leur service une expertise sur les situations de crise. C'est ce qu'a proposé le commissaire Lenarčič et je le rejoins totalement parce que c'est vraiment un vecteur de mobilisation considérable et je suis totalement acquis à l'idée qu'il faut agir beaucoup plus en équipe Europe. Et c'est la ligne que tu veux donner. Au-delà des réponses d'urgence que nous devons continuer à apporter aux crises, au-delà même du travail de fond que nous devons continuer à mener pour améliorer la résilience des sociétés par le développement et l'action climatique, nous devons aussi continuer à nous battre pour ce bien commun essentiel qu'est le droit international humanitaire. Quand, de manière criminelle, des bombardements indiscriminés frappent des zones habitées par des civils, quand, de manière irresponsable, des infrastructures essentielles à la vie des populations sont prises pour cible et détruites, quand, en dépit de la plus élémentaire humanité, la faim est utilisée comme une arme, alors la violence de la guerre échappe à tout cadre et cela doit tous nous inquiéter. C'est malheureusement la voie sur laquelle s'est engagée la Russie en Ukraine, en poussant le cynisme jusqu'à employer une rhétorique pseudo-humanitaire pour semer la confusion et mieux poursuivre ses exactions derrière le paravent d'accusations mensongères. Et c'est une autre voie que d'autres belligérants suivent également dans d'autres conflits. Et ce n'est pas le monde dans lequel nous voulons vivre. Nous devons donc impérativement enrayer cet engrenage mortifère de dérégulation et de brutalisation, car la multiplication et la banalisation des violations du droit international humanitaire constituent une régression absolument inacceptable. C'est le sens de l'appel à l'action humanitaire que l'Allemagne et la France ont lancé ensemble en 2019. Et c'est pourquoi nous plaidons en faveur d'un plan européen de formation au droit international humanitaire, comme nous l'avons fait nous-mêmes au niveau national. Le message que nous voulons envoyer aujourd'hui aux acteurs humanitaires du monde entier est très clair. Les Européens sont à vos côtés pour faciliter votre travail sur les théâtres de conflit. En luttant contre les pratiques dites de surconformité et en nous employant à introduire des clauses protectrices de l'action des acteurs humanitaires impartiaux dans des régimes de sanctions du Conseil de sécurité et de l'Union européenne. Et c'est dans cet esprit que nous avons, par exemple, proposé à nos partenaires européens d'introduire une exemption humanitaire dans les régimes de sanctions européens qui s'appliquent déjà aujourd'hui en Ukraine. Dans un monde qui redevient brutal, ma conviction est que la solidarité internationale doit être au cœur de la nouvelle géopolitique européenne qu'il nous faut inventer à 27 et avec les institutions européennes. J'indiquais il y a quelques instants que l'Europe, loin d'être seulement un bailleur, devait aussi se concevoir comme une puissance humanitaire. J'ai conscience de la nouveauté d'une telle expression, mais honnêtement, pour moi, c'est une réelle conviction. Car il y va de notre capacité à montrer par des actes concrets la force de notre modèle humaniste, et il y va aussi de notre capacité à répondre efficacement aux immenses défis du XXIe siècle aux côtés de nos partenaires du Sud. Et je vous remercie de votre attention.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Bien sûr, on est à vos côtés, mais il faut aller plus loin. Il faut aller plus loin avec l'équipe Europe. Now I would call Janis Lenarčić, Commissioner for Crisis Management. Mr. Lenarčić, please.
Dear Jean-Yves, dear ministers, ladies and gentlemen, this first ever European Humanitarian Forum is indeed taking place in very challenging circumstances. Circumstances that are marked by an exponential increase in humanitarian needs, and at the same time, the funding available to address those needs remains grossly inadequate. And I would like to focus in particular on one aspect, on the respect of international humanitarian law. Why? Because violations of the international humanitarian law both increase the humanitarian needs by bombing civilian infrastructure like schools, hospitals, and so on, and at the same time make the work of our humanitarian partners much more difficult because they're also being the targets or they are denied the access to people in need. This is why I really would like to take the opportunity of the presence of the ministers to appeal for two things in particular. First, please do increase humanitarian funding. And I salute the recent decision by France to triple its humanitarian budget. And the pictures that we see and the reports we get from Ukraine, from Yemen, from the Sahel, or Ethiopia, to name just some of them, point to the necessity of placing the respect for the international humanitarian law at the heart of European external action. And this is my second appeal for the ministers. Please include the respect for international humanitarian law in the heart of our joint European external action. We have the tools, and we need to put them to good use. And we can do, among other things, strengthen the IHL compliance framework. We can include it in all our EU external instruments, the compliance with IHL. We can include due diligence measures in, for instance, when we provide support through our European Peace Facility. And also, we can advocate the respect for IHL through our extensive political, security, and human rights dialogues that we have with a number of third countries. But we must also have the courage to identify where we need to do more. Lack of compliance with international humanitarian law and impunity for violations contribute to the worsening of the humanitarian crisis and undermine international stability and security. Respect for IHL is therefore a precondition for safe, effective and unimpeded humanitarian access and for the safety and security of humanitarian and healthcare workers. There is one particular matter with which I wish to conclude my intervention. It is not optimal to advocate for respect of IHL on the basis of abstract or anecdotal information. Of course, we and our partners on the ground in particular, we can see the violations are happening. But it would help, in my view, to have a credible, systematic collection of data and competent expert analysis of such data on IHL violations that would better guide our policy making, advocacy, and action. The Commission is ready to support initiatives and ideas on how an independent, factual information on violations could come forward, be analyzed, and acted upon. We look forward to hearing proposals in this regard and to discuss these ideas further in the coming days and weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. More courage and more funding. Very important for the European Peace Facility. I'd like to call up the next speaker, who is a co-launcher of the European Humanitarian Call for Action. Madame Baerbock, please. Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs. Bitte.
Thanks a lot, colleagues, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. President Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine has been raging for almost a month now, attacking not only the sovereignty of an independent nation, of our European peace and of the UN Charter, but also marking severe violation of international humanitarian law, which we thought would never happen again in our common European house. President Putin's bombs and missiles are striking Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. His troops besieging cities are denying passage of humanitarian assistance. In Mariupol, the Russian military attacked a theater being used as a shelter for civilians, where people have written children in front of the theater, as well as a maternity hospital, and the images of pregnant women amid burning rubble shocked all of us. Since the beginning of President Putin's war, the World Health Organization has registered more than 40 attacks on medical facilities, transport supplies, personnel, and patients. According to UNICEF, more than 230 educational facilities have been destroyed. And the United Nations Population Fund is receiving more and more reports about gender-based violence. The fact of the matter is that only one man can stop these atrocities, and this is President Putin. And this is why it's important also today at this forum, where we are talking about all humanitarian assistance, humanitarian law, and humanitarian relief, that we name the perpetrator currently here in Europe. We have to urge Russia to uphold its obligations under international humanitarian law by calling out the Russian attacks against Ukraine's civilians and civilian infrastructure as what they are, a gross violation of international law, and by making it clear that we will hold perpetrators accountable using all the means and mechanisms at our disposal. Courts will have to rule, but for me, these are war crimes and crimes against humanity. Moreover, we need to give humanitarian organizations our full political support, and I would thank here the international community of the Red Cross, but all the other civilian organizations for all the things they have done in the past weeks, being bombed by themselves. And this is something where we show that humanitarian aid is being delivered in every minute. So thanks a lot to your organizations. With the humanitarian call for action, we have committed to defending international humanitarian law and to protecting humanitarian workers. We are insisting on access for humanitarian organizations, and we are making sure that our sanctions do not hamper humanitarian assistance. Finally, and this has been said already, but we have to underline this every minute and every hour, we have to step up humanitarian funding. Germany has increased its support to UN agencies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the German Red Cross, and many others. I firmly believe that this is our duty as human beings to protect the humanitarian space and save lives through humanitarian action. I'm grateful to you, Commissioner, and also to you, Jean-Yves Le Drian, for bringing us together here today. Together we appeal the world. Please support humanitarian organization and the humanitarian call for action. Thanks a lot.
Frau Minister, vielen Dank. Vielen Dank. A call to action, a step up funding, and one man can stop what is going on. And we must also investigate for potential war crimes. Let us go now to the ministerial interventions from the floor. And this is going to be very challenging because there is a 2-minute limit for every speaker. Can we do this? Martin Griffiths, you are online with us, United Nations Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Mr. Griffiths, you have the floor for 2 minutes.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. I shall try and be to time. I was thinking about, in terms of making these few remarks, that I was in a capital where one crisis is particular, and it's not Ukraine, by the way, it's another one. And I was being asked by a member of the diplomatic community, did I get guarantees from those I talked with about humanitarian access? And as I heard this question, I realized I don't think I've ever had credible guarantees about humanitarian access in any of these big crises. And so we start with the proposition, which is daily life for all of us involved in the humanitarian project, that IHL and access is fraying more and more each day. That's, I think, my first very obvious point. Hence, the idea of a call for action is most welcome. The second point is that negotiating access requires us to be neutral and impartial. Of course, we'll be hearing more from others in the course of this discussion. But it really requires us to bring the parties together. That's why we are present in Moscow, for example, talking to the Russian Ministry of Defense and keen to get them to sit alongside the Ukrainian authorities to get more operational, professional reality into these proposals for corridors, which are so important. So talking to all, as in the words of one famous humanitarian who will be speaking later, you talk to the devil, him or herself, to save one life. So we talk to all, and we talk to all impartially. Getting access means that naming and shaming, calling people out, is often not the priority of operational humanitarian organizations. Our aim is to get access to make people get served in the way they need to be served. And that is sometimes misunderstood. 2 final points very quickly. Sanctions. We're very worried around the world about the chilling effect of sanctions in particular. We welcome more and more work being done on carve-outs by many member states, including here in the European Union. It's very important. And finally, misinformation and disinformation. We are, like others, accused of fake news. We've been accused of that in the Ukraine context already. We're in touch with many of the social media platforms to make them genuinely involved in this effort. And there, I think, much more needs to be done to get them to understand also the issues about hate speech and the limits and the legal requirements. The call for action, I think, can also help us in that regard. So finally, to say this is a massively important issue. We in OCHA see it, I think, as one of our priority issues. Access negotiations, fair access, unimpeded access, principled access, an access which brings the parties together to meet their obligations for the sake of the people who suffer from their actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin Griffiths. Thank you. Thank you. I would like now to call Pekka Olavi-Haavisto, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Finland, please. Mr. Haavisto. Yes, please. And if I can remind all the speakers now that it's 2 minutes, please, if we can stay to time.
Thank you. Thank you for this possibility of being here, and thanks Jean-Yves and Commissioner for organizing and bringing this together, and of course with the most important topics: international humanitarian law, humanitarian funding, humanitarian access. And it's a timely question, particularly related to Ukraine, as was expressed here. We have also seen situation also in Ukraine where humanitarians are targeted, humanitarians are prevented of doing their life-saving assistance. Of course, these are also violations against the international humanitarian law. I would like to take three conclusions of the situation in Ukraine. First is actually about the situation of the most vulnerable people. We have seen now people who have probably cars, who have relatives or friends in Europe and others, but we haven't yet seen people in hospitals, people in childcare and so forth, or people in different institutions who cannot help themselves. And these are people who are now surrounded and encircled in the cities, and we need to help them. My second point are the environmental consequences of this kind of conflicts. I've used many years in UNEP to investigating war and environment issues. We have been witnessing how dangerous this kind of conflict, modern conflict, can be, for example, for the nuclear power plants and increasing the nuclear risks in Ukraine. And my third point is actually the accountability. How do we get those who are violating the rules accountable for these issues? And how do we use the international institutions to bring the justice also in this kind of situations? We have to act now. This is very timely, and I think the Ukraine has been a wake-up call also for the humanitarian community and our governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Haristo. Thank you very much. Next is Luigi Di Maio, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Italy. Per favore.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues. Thank Minister Le Drian and Commissioner Lenarčič for co-hosting the first European Humanitarian Forum. The unacceptable Russian aggression against Ukraine with attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructures is causing the most serious humanitarian crisis in Europe after the Second World War. This highlights the importance of international humanitarian law that must be respected always and by all parties. It also calls on us to act swiftly, decisively, and united to condemn violations and ensure respect of principles at the very core of the international order. The European Union is a strong supporter of international humanitarian law and humanitarian actors. Humanitarian crises in the world require an effective and efficient EU response. As one of the largest humanitarian donors, the European Union can make a difference. Coordination with the United Nations system is essential, also with regard to the humanitarian development peace nexus. An effective EU action relies also on strengthened synergies with member states, as demonstrated by the EU civil protection mechanism. Today's challenges in scenarios such as Ukraine, Afghanistan, Yemen, the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, Northern Africa and Libya in particular show the need for a strong European Union on the international humanitarian stage. Italy is playing its part. In Ukraine, we have contributed more than 25 million euro to the UN system and the International Red Cross movement's appeals, financed with 10 million euro a UNHCR project in Moldova to assist refugees and organizing kind donation, including in the framework of EU civil protection mechanism. In Afghanistan, we allocated 150 million euro last year, mainly for humanitarian assistance. We channeled 24 million euro to Pakistan and Iran for assisting refugees. In the Horn of Africa and Sahel, we are contributing a lot to the activities of international organizations. Rest ensured about Italy's continuous commitment in support of the essential work of humanitarian partners and to an even stronger role of the EU as a humanitarian global actor. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Ministro. Grazie. I would like to now go to Eva Maria Limets, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Estonia, please. And as you're listening, please keep in mind European Humanitarian Forum, the hashtag. If you hear a good line, please cast it wider.
Thank you, dear organizers, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Widespread abuses of human rights and violation of international humanitarian law have raised the humanitarian needs globally to an all-time high. Therefore, it is even more appalling to see Russia, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, whose main responsibility is maintaining international peace and security, committing war crimes by bombing civilians, hospitals, and humanitarian corridors in Ukraine. As Estonia just completed its term as an elected member of the United Nations Security Council, we witnessed firsthand the challenges in agreeing to humanitarian principles. But when people's lives are in stake, politics and power plays should be left aside. Ending the war is still the main goal, but to save lives, we need to make sure UN member states are demanding Russia to respect international law and fully honor agreements for safe humanitarian passages. Furthermore, we need to show our full support to everyone providing life-saving assistance on the ground. Estonia continues to provide flexible and needs-based humanitarian assistance. We highly appreciate the EU's committed effort in coordinating humanitarian aid and the work of international and local humanitarian organizations in front lines. Humanitarian relief personnel must be respected and protected. Our attention should be with the humanitarian aid and medical workers who go the last mile to reach and help those most in need. Dear colleagues, allow me to stress Estonia's long-standing goal to fight against impunity. Accountability remains one of the key instruments of prevention. In this regard, all violations of international law, including war crimes and crimes against humanity, must be held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister Limets. We now go to Eamon Gilmore, EU Special Representative for Human Rights. Mr. Gilmore, please.
Ministers, fellow speakers, I want to thank Minister Le Drian and Commissioner Lenarchik for organising this important event. I have just returned from Przemyśl and Medyka on the Polish-Ukraine border, where I have witnessed on the faces of Ukrainian refugees the pain of the violations of international humanitarian law now being perpetrated by the Russian aggressors. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not the only IHL crisis that we are facing. We have been for some time now experiencing an avalanche of crises in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Sahel, Myanmar, Syria, Yemen, and other conflict-affected areas in the world. Respect for international humanitarian law is essential to save lives and to uphold the human dignity of all in armed conflict. And we all need to do more to ensure such respect for IHL. I want to suggest 3 areas to which we need to give attention. Firstly, holding perpetrators accountable is essential to deter future violations, to promote respect for the law and, of course, to provide avenues for redress for victims. And to fight impunity, we need better monitoring and systematic documentation of violations, as well as national implementation of IHL. Secondly, we need to better leverage political and economic weight to promote IHL compliance by consistently condemning violations, stepping up advocacy efforts in support of the protection of civilians and IHL, using platforms of which we are a leading voice, and continuing to providing training in IHL. And thirdly, we can learn and make better use of positive examples of compliance with IHL. What prompts a party in an armed conflict to act in accordance with IHL or not? Understanding these motivations can help us improve the respect for the rules of war, and the ICRC's initiative, IHL in Action, is very important in that regard. And finally, we need to make clear to all that the rules of war are not an optional, they are an obligation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gilmore. Thank you. Another person we see all too often on the ground is Filippo Grandi, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Mr. Grandi, please.
Thank you, Jean-Yves and Yanis, for this invitation. Disregard for international humanitarian law is a major cause of displacement, as has already been said, for more than 84 million people around the world. And around the world, how can civilians cope if they are targeted by military or militants, if not by fleeing, if they can? When basic services, water, health facilities, and schools are damaged and destroyed. When even people fleeing are shelled and shot at. Mariupol is a tragic symbol of what war does to people today. And Ukraine indeed proves the point, and horribly so. And as a result, in just 3 weeks, 10 million people have been displaced in the country or abroad in the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. And we have seen this also in Syria, in Yemen, in Burkina Faso, in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan, where I have just visited, and beyond. But even wars have rules. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, as we know, must be protected, and we must continue to repeat it, even when it is in vain. And humanitarian access must be guaranteed. As humanitarian actors, by the way, we uphold the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and systematically strive to stay and deliver, including in areas of conflict. But this has become extremely difficult, as parties disrespect the rules precisely to target civilians or even impede aid. At the same time, we find ourselves in increasingly complex situations in which, as Martin Griffiths said, we must deal with unrecognized or sanctioned entities in highly politicized context. But of course, humanitarian action, vital as it is not the solution. Diplomacy and negotiation at all levels, including and especially from you, ministers, are required to leverage parties to conflicts, including non-state armed groups, to create humanitarian space. And ultimately, it is diplomacy, your diplomacy, that must prevail to end conflicts, enable peace, and ensure that all civilians, including the displaced, have the safety and support needed to stay or to return home and rebuild their lives. Thank you.
Filippo Grandi, thank you very much. I'd like to go now to Andreas Katsaniotis, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Greece. Please.
Thank you, sir. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is as simple as that. Today, we have war on European soil. Today, we have a humanitarian and refugee crisis on European soil. Today, we must act. We must help. Today, more than ever, we need to refocus on international humanitarian law. Though universally accepted, the rules of the 4th Geneva Convention on International Humanitarian Law are often disregarded and violated on the ground. Is this lack of respect for international humanitarian law the one and the only issue? No. We also have lack of appropriate mechanism for monitoring and promoting compliance with its norms as well. Increasing reports of attacks on civilians, humanitarian and medical workers, as well as civilian facilities such as hospitals and schools, demonstrate in the most dramatic terms the urgent need to preserve and protect the humanitarian space. The latter, far from being an abstract concept, must be concretely identified and defined in each situation of armed conflict, taking into account the needs of people suffering the brutal and painful consequences of war. Greece has always been a reliable and trustworthy supporter of international humanitarian law. Side by side with the European Union and so many others, we believe we have a key role to fulfill and safeguarding humanitarian space through improving compliance with international humanitarian law. States have, pursuant to Common Article 1 of the 4th Geneva Convention, the obligation to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law in all circumstances. Moreover, according to its founding treaties, the Union's action on the international scene must be guided by respect for human dignity, the principles of equality and solidarity, and respect from the principles of the United Nations character and international law, including international humanitarian law. In light of the above, it's of utmost importance to take concrete steps as laid down in the Council conclusion of 20 May of 2021, the strengthened to existing international humanitarian law compliance framework. Within this context, we must seek to take full advantage of the means of action provided from the European Union guidelines on promoting compliance with international humanitarian law. These guidelines, adopted by the Council in 2005 and updated in 2009, offer a broad set of tools at our disposal to promote compliance with international humanitarian law, including, among others, accountability for serious breaches of international humanitarian law and help victims of atrocities to achieve justice. Regarding, in particular, accountability and the fight against impunity, we cannot but highlight the crucial role of the ICC, the only permanent treaty-based criminal court, the work of which Greece, together with its European Union partners, fully and consistently support for the very first day. To conclude, in the face of the challenges posed by present-day armed conflicts, it is time for Member States and the European Union to stand up and take action to ensure better compliance with international humanitarian law and thus safeguarded and humanitarian space in which persons in need receive protection and assistance with humanitarian actors and granted safe access to fulfill their mandate. Thank you.
Evcharisto. I'd like to go now to Daniela Gilman, Secretary of State, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Romania. Madam Gilman, please. Gitman, I'm so sorry. Gitman.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would also like to thank Minister Le Drian and Commissioner Lenarčič for organizing this humanitarian forum. I think we all need now a very strategic debate between the European Union and the wider international humanitarian community, and I think this forum will serve as one. Today, we witness the horror of war on our immediate vicinity, including the devastating effects of unacceptable breaches of international humanitarian law. Any attacks resulting on the civil casualties and essential civilian infrastructure damaging are strongly condemnable. Our most important mission now is to safeguard Euro-Atlantic and global security and the rule-based international system. This completely unjustified, illegal, and unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine is a very serious violation of the international law. It is of utmost importance to place compliance with the IHL at the heart of our external action to protect civilian population, support principled humanitarian action, and protect humanitarian and healthcare workers. Romania anchored its foreign policy on the safeguard of the rule of law. It has constantly worked to strengthen the compliance with the international humanitarian law and supported the humanitarian call for action aimed at advancing humanitarian objectives. The underlying problem is not a lack of rules, but is a lack of enforcement of the rules. We saw these shortages many times, as our predecessors said, in crises in Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan. We need independent data collection and analysis of IHL violations with due regard to avoiding the political instrumentations of such exercises. Alleged violation of IHL must be recorded to ensure accountability. The state cooperations with the International Criminal Court and other investigative mechanisms at the international level is of paramount importance with a view to fighting impunity for the most serious crimes. In this vein, allow me to welcome the International Court of Justice order on provisional measures in the Ukraine versus Russia case, calling on Russia's side to support military operation, to suspend military operation on the Ukrainian territory. The European Union is an influential humanitarian actor with a strong commitment to humanitarian diplomacy, which is a fundamental pillar of our action. We need to foster the promotion of the IHL compliance in the dialogue with our third parties, and we need to see what kind of new technologies that have entered the modern battlefield can be better understood and better analyzed in order to reduce these challenges. In conclusion, I would say that the actions of international level must be matched by our efforts to ensure the respect of IHL domestically, bring IHL home. Thank you.
Madam Minister, thank you very much. And now Gaspar Dovžan, who is Secretary of State, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia. Please.
Let me also, first of all, thank Minister Le Drian and Commissioner Lenarčič for co-hosting this event. It's very timely and very important topic. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that all wars and conflicts are equally in their tragedy. However, when the international humanitarian law is violated, the consequences and impacts are even greater. Grave violations of humanitarian principles and human rights, upsurge in hostilities, killings of civilians, and attacks on civilian infrastructure should not happen in the modern era. Nevertheless, we are witnessing all those in the most brutal form in the war in Ukraine. Protection of civilians, especially those most vulnerable in the circumstances of war, as well as humanitarian and health workers, lies at the core of all international humanitarian law. No violation of humanitarian law and human rights law should remain unpunished. We need to voice these concerns on every occasion in the international fora and stay focused to pursue the accountability for violations committed. In this regard, Slovenia supports the investigation and prosecution of international crimes committed, including the crime of aggression, at the international and national level. Slovenia welcomes the establishment of the UN Commission of Inquiry to investigate the alleged violations of international humanitarian law and human rights committed during Russia's military aggression on Ukraine. Appalling human tragedy in Ukraine brought us together. The EU responded quickly and united. We have never been so decisive in our action and so effective in providing assistance. However, the humanitarian situation is not likely to improve very soon, and we have to make mid- and long-term commitments and increase the funds and our efforts to help those in need. With this being said, we cannot afford out of sight, out of mind approach when it comes to other wars and conflicts with the same dire humanitarian consequences. I'm thinking of Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Haiti, Yemen, and there are many more. As EU, we have a moral obligation and also means to support those in need. I fully support the proposals for action indicated by the European Commissioner Lenarčič. International humanitarian law is as relevant today as ever. We should find the necessary political will and use all instruments we have to implement it effectively and to contribute rapidly to reducing human suffering that wars and conflicts are causing globally. Thank you very much.
Mr. Dovzhan, thank you very much. I would like now for our final word among the ministerial interventions online with Paweł Jabłoński, Undersecretary of State, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Poland. Dzień dobry, Mr. Jabłoński. Can you hear me?
I can hear you good. Dziękuję. Thank you very much.
Proszę bardzo. So you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'll
thank
try
you.
to be brief. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Jean-Yves, Yanis, thank you very much for organizing this. I wanted very badly to be here with you in Brussels, but because of the enormous volume of tasks that we are doing right now to coordinate the humanitarian effort on the ground in Poland and also for Ukraine, I unfortunately had to stay in Warsaw. And when we were starting with the preparations, obviously none of us could have imagined how much the topic of tonight's event will be of concern. And in this current geopolitical landscape, in the world security architecture that it's being every day and every hour undermined by Russia, it's even more urgent to recognize the principles of international humanitarian law. Adherence to its norms is in the interest of the whole international community, because in addition to protecting individuals, especially the most vulnerable groups as women, children, elderly people, persons with disabilities, it also serves to ensure international peace and security. And over the past 3.5 weeks, we have been witnessing Russia deliberately creating humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine, bluntly disregarding the principles of international humanitarian law. And the escalation of conflict in Ukraine has resulted in many civilian casualties, caused destruction of infrastructure, and has forced millions of people to flee their homes, seeking safety, protection, and assistance. ICC has decided to open an investigation into the situation in Ukraine, as it has jurisdiction over any acts of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes committed within the territory of Ukraine. And Poland welcomes this decision, as we believe that fighting impunity is of paramount importance now, to ensure that violations of international humanitarian law do not go unpunished, to deliver justice to victims. As a part of prevention of atrocity crimes is ensuring that anyone responsible for such crimes is held accountable. Polish government and our state prosecution service have already started collecting evidence and documenting those crimes, and we also know of the efforts of many of other governments. We strongly commend these efforts. We believe that we must work together to bring this case to an international level. Also, I wanted to draw your attention to one more very important consequence of Russian war against Ukraine, one of the world's major producers of wheat. Russia's actions exacerbate the growing threat of hunger and malnutrition in vulnerable areas globally. This is why the war in Ukraine is not just a regional, European or East-West issue, but a conflict that will have its consequences also in Asia, Africa, and all other continents. This is why the most important task today for the international community is to bring this war to an end as soon as possible, by all means at our availability, by supporting Ukrainian defense effort, by stronger sanctions against Russian oil, gas, and coal, to save innocent lives and bring every perpetrator to justice. Thank you very much.
Panie Jabłoński, dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much. This wraps up the ministerial interventions. Now we would like to show you a video as we call up this panel discussion. If the panelists could come up while the video is playing, that would save a bit of time. We're going to see some voices from around the world talking about humanitarian law and rights. Please.
Shapa yir kila kan. Kan the Buddha ranam. Tikira zoi. Ton number paton la kom na la ham patan ya la. Bri kama shati dik pon pon. Ti wata yo shoka pon wa lo bala lo. To bri kama انتبه شال قشيتي لبلبه تمشي ولا موريك ما بيلبه توريك ما بين مها نعم أنا شيرو ممجين بينه ممجين بيوم لدي مها بيمي في يتامي تبيتوك ما أنا كايكا.
The international humanitarian law is fundamental for the survival and protection of civilians in armed conflict that are not part of the conflict but that are often used as victims. But it is also fundamental for the successful operation of humanitarian organizations such as mine. The humanitarian principles of humanity, independence, impartiality, and neutrality are essential for the success of our work. We cannot be subject to attacks while providing assistance and helping people survive the armed conflict.
Bueno, yo creo que sí, es más bien una necesidad, es un derecho. Es un derecho de que deberían establecer de que sí, de vivir en paz, porque pues igual estamos como metidos en un conflicto que nada que ver.
Мы выезжали с Холодной горы, там уже стреляли, вызвала такси, таксист сказал, что он перебрал свою семью куда-то за город, и он работает. Я говорю, почему не уезжаете? Так кто, как, если не мы. Стреляли уже, это было утро, стреляли на Холодной горе, при этом люди параллельно шли спокойно за хлебом, то есть у многих еще есть еще надежда, что все будет хорошо.
The international humanitarian law, it's very important to be respected by all parties, mainly during the crisis. The main issue is that to save the life of population and also for the health workers working during any crisis.
Rather chilling that commentary by the Ukrainian woman, that the hope that everything's going to be okay, but when? And what has happened since then? I'd like to introduce you to our panel first. Robert Mardini, Director General, International Committee of the Red Cross. Ilse Brands-Keres, United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. And Maria Arena, Chair of the European Parliament's Subcommittee on Human Rights, and Jan Egeland, Secretary General, Norwegian Refugee Council, who I've known for a long time, actually, having been on the ground in many places as a journalist, ex-Human Rights Watch as well, right? And also Gloria Gaggioli, of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law. Gloria, welcome, and human rights. Let us go first to Roberto Mardini. And with the ICRC, who I've seen also many times on the ground, what's the state of international humanitarian law at this point? That's almost a no-brainer, but if you could very quickly tell us this, and including in the light of the Ukrainian crisis, what are the gaps, the challenges, the possible ways forward? And to remind all of you that you have 4 minutes. My gosh, please.
Thank you very much. Minister Le Drian, Commissioner Lenarčič, thank you for convening this important event today. Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the year 2022 has taken an alarming turn for Europe. The international armed conflict in Ukraine and its devastating human cost is posing extraordinary challenges for state and for all of us gathered here. Effective political and diplomatic efforts are urgently needed to put an end to this conflict. But conflicts around the globe tell us a hard truth. Respect for international humanitarian law, IHL, cannot be taken for granted. They show us that IHL is as much about prevention and dialogue as it is about responding to violations. And they remind us that IHL is universal and is everyone's concern, as we've seen it in this video. By universally ratifying the 4 Geneva Conventions, states have affirmed unequivocally the humanitarian and protective nature of IHL that must be applied without distinction, without exceptions, and irrespective of the parties to the conflict, their origins, their behavior, or their motives. Today, I would like to bring to the fore some of the most pressing challenges we witness on a global scale. While the armed conflict in Ukraine and its devastating humanitarian consequences are currently dominating the headlines, there are many other conflicts and grave humanitarian crises that risk falling below the international radar. Places like Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Syria, and Yemen, and the list goes on. It is vital that we keep the spotlights on these crises too. Protracted conflict continue to be widespread, some of them worsening. Armed conflict continue to urbanize, endangering civilians and the infrastructure they depend on. Separated families remain without contact with their loved ones. Armed groups continue to fragment and elude responsibility. And state operating through state and non-state partners and proxies do the same. Technology continues to develop rapidly with cyber operations, autonomous weapons, and the use of outer space, raising questions about the application and the interpretation of IHL. In a report that we are publishing today, the ICRC has chosen to highlight 12 IHL issues for 2022. For each of these challenges, we provide tools and resources for states to overcome them and ensure compliance with IHL. You, the EU, and the state gathered here today have it within your power to act today and take measures that will have a concrete and positive impact on these problems. I'd like to highlight just 4 of the most pressing and urgent measures. 1, take the dire humanitarian consequences of urban warfare seriously and commit to avoiding the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. 2, leverage your support to positively influence parties to armed conflicts, states and non-states to respect IHL. 3, remove all obstacles impeding the work and access to neutral, impartial and independent humanitarian organizations to persons in need, in particular through humanitarian exemptions in sanctions and counter-terrorism regimes. And 4, above all, prevent IHL violations by adopting legislations, policies and practices that bring IHL home. Allow me to conclude with a call to all of you gathered here. Our collective work towards IHL compliance must at all costs remain shielded from politicization, because ultimately IHL is not about politics, it's about humanity. Thank you.
Mr. Mogherini, thank you very much. I would like to call now Ilse Brans-Karas of the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. Given the role of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OCHR, what is the role in monitoring of IHL and human rights violations, how to improve data on violations and compliance with IHL and human rights in conflicts? Please.
Thank you very much, Monsieur le Ministre, Monsieur Le Drian, Monsieur le Commissaire Lenarčič, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues. It's important to be part of this event on humanitarian law and protection of civilians. And of course, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights indeed works daily on these issues, the protection of civilians, protection of international humanitarian law and human rights law. The connection between them, of course, is very evident and I think needs to be brought to the fore at the center of all activities, as Commissioner Lenarčič said. So the monitoring, documentation and reporting is indeed a core aspect of the protection mandate that OHCHR has, granted by the General Assembly, but it's also a critical function of our field presences. That is, regardless of whether they're established through a General Assembly mandate or part of a UN peace operations as such. We also support, you may have heard of investigative bodies that we have been supporting, commissions of inquiry or fact-finding missions, and the most recent one was established just a couple of weeks ago, the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, indeed. So many of the OHCHR presences operate in context when IHL applicability threshold has been reached already. So it adds the humanitarian law framework to that of international human rights law. And that is where we do the monitoring of both. And I think we are in a privileged position to look at that current state of both frameworks presently. The conflicts as such, we know it all, have become more complex. Disrespect for the key principles of distinction proportionality under IHL is on the increase. And in many cases, indeed alarming. So we know that civilians and civilian infrastructure, we heard it already mentioned, schools, hospitals, and others are hit and in some cases even targeted. We need for this, to be able to address this, we obviously need data. And that was mentioned as a key aspect. However, we need quality data. The issue here, where we're saying how we're improving the data, is indeed a key recommendation that I also would like to stress is something that we focus on very much. It has to be credible data, independent data, and unbiased. So that is, of course, a prerequisite to engage with the international community for all of our engagement, but also for constructive engagement with those we monitor themselves, and in fact can play that constructive role. For this, we have learned we need substantive knowledge, a distinct set of technical skills, and also the application of thorough methodology when we do this collection of data and processes. We rigorously process, we train, and we do quality control on the data. Sometimes it takes a little longer because of doing that. But also when we work with partners, as we did, the recent example and innovative approach we had with the Ethiopian Commission, Human Rights Commission on a joint investigation, we first train our partners. We agree on the methodology and we train our partners. This is an essential part of improving the data we have. So we know that the challenges of monitoring, of course, also brings with it the risks to the safety of personnel, the risks of expulsion, some of those aspects that were mentioned already. But clearly we need to continue working to improve this. I just wanted to mention, almost finished, that we also, part of the engagement that we are pursuing is also together with the EU, we are to enable peace operations to comply with IHL and human rights law. And that means also, I'm referring to a compliance framework that we're working on, in particular on the G5 Sahel Joint Forces, also now specifically starting with the AU, together with the EU, to be able to ensure that. Certainly, we know the last thing, that when we do this, the human rights and human rights law compliance, it actually brings dividends. It's dividends not only to protection, not only to operational activity, but also political dividends. And we can do it when we work on it together, following the high quality that we, of course, pursue in this. So thank you very much.
Madam Brents-Karitz, thank you very much. I'd like to now call Maria Arena, please, Chair of the European Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights. How can the EU improve compliance with IHL and fight impunity. How do we do that, Maria?
Thank you very much. I will do it in French. I think it's possible. We have translation, so I prefer using my language. So, merci beaucoup. Je vais le faire en français. Tout d'abord, merci pour cette invitation et pour l'organisation. Je représente ici la voix du Parlement européen. Et en tant que présidente de la sous-commission aux droits de l'homme, je dois vous avouer qu'il n'y a pas une seule réunion que nous avons aujourd'hui au Parlement européen, dans cette sous-commission aux droits de l'homme, où une personne n'est pas venue nous parler de cette question de la lutte contre l'impunité. Chaque personne invitée dans cette sous-commission qui parle de la question des droits de l'homme nous parle de la question de la lutte contre l'impunité, que ce soit un défenseur des droits de l'homme, que ce soit un journaliste, un chercheur, un académique, une organisation internationale, ITS le sait très bien, a été invité, ou encore Eamon Gilmore qui vient régulièrement de notre commission. Cette question de l'impunité est cruciale. Alors c'est vrai qu'on a aussi des artistes. La semaine dernière, un réalisateur de films qui a réalisé le film Little Palestine est venu nous parler, ce réalisateur, de ce camp de réfugiés palestiniens qui a été détruit dans les abords de Damas. Et nous avons aussi reçu, par exemple, le docteur Mukwege venir nous parler des violences faites aux femmes dans l'est du Congo, ou encore Sherazad Akbar, qui est venu nous parler de la situation des femmes afghanes aujourd'hui sous les talibans. Alors c'est vrai que quand on parle d'impunité, on se rend compte que même là où on essaye de mettre en œuvre des mécanismes internationaux de lutte contre l'impunité, eh bien ces auteurs de crimes restent, je dirais, libres aujourd'hui dans le monde de manière générale. Et donc comment peut-on renforcer cela? Alors je vais mettre un accent particulier sur le rôle des acteurs de collecte d'informations. Itz l'a dit tout à l'heure, il est important d'avoir une collecte fiable d'informations. Et des partenaires importants de la sous-commission aux droits de l'homme, c'est la société civile. Alors cette société civile, souvent on a tendance, dans des crises humanitaires importantes, à dire « oui, mais cette collecte d'informations n'est peut-être pas la première priorité. Il faut d'abord soigner, il faut d'abord apporter l'aide en tant que telle. » Et la collecte d'informations vient souvent comme une deuxième priorité. Alors, je pense que cette société civile, au moment des crises en particulier, doit être extrêmement soutenue, parce qu'elle le fait au risque et au péril de sa vie. Et donc, un premier message que nous devons donner, bien entendu, c'est de soutenir la société civile de manière permanente dans la durée, parce que la qualité de cette société civile ne s'invente pas du jour au lendemain. Si elle est, je dirais, de qualité, c'est parce qu'elle a été aidée pendant des périodes beaucoup plus longues. Et donc, l'aider de manière permanente et lui donner le soutien au moment où les crises arrivent me semble être la première des priorités que nous devons donner. La deuxième priorité en tant qu'Union européenne, c'est bien entendu de soutenir les mécanismes internationaux de lutte contre l'impunité. Bien entendu, le soutien à la Cour pénale internationale. Alors ça semble anodin de le dire, mais il n'y a pas si longtemps que ça, j'entendais M. Trump qui condamnait les juges de la Cour pénale internationale, qui disait que ces juges seraient poursuivis par l'administration américaine s'ils faisaient des enquêtes. Et donc il est important que nous puissions, nous, Union européenne, soutenir des instruments tels que cela. Et enfin, le dernier message que j'aimerais donner, c'est que nous devons éviter les doubles standards. Alors c'est vrai qu'il y a parfois des situations qui nous touche plus particulièrement, et la question de l'Ukraine étant sur le continent européen nous touche bien entendu fort, mais soyons attentifs à ne pas avoir de double standard, que ce soit en matière d'accueil des migrants et des personnes qui ont besoin de cette protection, ou que ce soit en matière de lutte contre l'impunité. Vous savez, M. Mukwege, ça fait des années qu'il se bat contre l'impunité en RDC, et malheureusement, il n'a pas toujours été entendu à sa juste valeur. Et donc, soyons attentifs à cette question de double standard et ne soyons pas, je dirais, attaqués par l'extérieur parce que nous n'avons pas appliqué les mêmes règles partout. Merci.
Maria Elena, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Our final speaker, Jan Egeland, Secretary General, Norwegian Refugee Council. Jan, I can't remember where we interviewed, but it could have been Somalia, Rwanda, Kosovo, Afghanistan. I'm not sure where, but you've been everywhere. Please.
Thank you very much. I've listened attentively all this afternoon, and I am happy to hear how much the European Union and the European member states will do to support us in our work to protect civilians in their hour of greatest need. We share the outrage on behalf of the children of Mariupol, of Kharkiv, and all of the other places that I visited just before the invasion. We have 70 aid workers on the ground. And we expect the same outrage for the children killed in the Congo, across the Sahel, in Yemen, in Syria, and elsewhere. Now, I have some very concrete hopes where we want to see action. First, strong, coordinated, robust diplomacy, humanitarian diplomacy, with the parties and their sponsors, real-time and hopefully preventively. We need to see you in Sana'a, in Aden, in Benghazi, in Tripoli. We need to see you also in Tehran and in Riyadh. You need to be there. You need to speak with those who have influence. We need you to engage with Moscow and Beijing and Washington, D.C. and other places who have influence and who sell arms and who are involved in all of these places. Do not only speak to your adversary vis-à-vis the media, you need to speak to your friends, those whom you sell arms to as well. We need to see you. We need to see you there. And we need to see you also when we are ourselves penalized for speaking out, for being principled. NRC, my organization, has been suspended in 3 countries by assertive governments the last 18 months because we spoke out and because we stood for principles with the civilians. Second point is, we need you to depoliticize humanitarian aid. There needs to be standard exemptions in all counterterrorism laws and all sanctions law for humanitarian work. We need to be there now for Ukrainians on both sides of front lines. We have already staff in area taken over by Russian forces. I haven't seen a very clear and full exemption in the recent sanctions that will enable us to work for all Ukrainians, irrespective of who controls territory. And then aid can only be given by needs alone. So tell your development donors that beneficiary vetting cannot happen. We cannot ask a widow, did your husband perhaps fight for one of the listed organizations? We have to ask her, are your children starving? And then, finally, we need the tools of deconfliction, humanitarian notification to work. Help us get up through the UN and elsewhere system so that there are notification systems for the civilian sites, for the refugee camps, for the hospitals, etc., so they are not bombed like in Syria and Ukraine and elsewhere. The humanitarian notification is an old tool. It works in some conflicts, it does not in others. One of the tools that can also happen is that you say to the government representatives, can we at least agree to provide humanitarian aid to people without politicization and thereby have a humanitarian task force? We had such a task force in Geneva with the US, with Russia, and with the regional powers in and around Syria. And we were able to negotiate access for convoys and deconflict much of our humanitarian work, even when the war raged. And then, in the end, we failed also here. But it is a tool that should be needed. be used because the protection crisis is growing while we're making progress on assistance. We cannot continue to have so many people suffer alone with zero protection. Thank you.
Jan Egeland, thank you very much. I misspoke because we do have one more speaker. It's Gloria Gagioli, Director of Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. And there are gaps in monitoring and reporting, Gloria. So perhaps could there be an annual system of reporting those gaps, perhaps, and exposing them? What do you think?
Thank you, Mr. Burns. First of all, I would like to thank Minister Le Drian and Commissioner Lenarčič for co-hosting this event, this very important event, and the Geneva Academy is very honored to be part of the discussion. So thank you. The monitoring and reporting on IHL violations is essential. Actually, it is a precondition of the obligation to respect and ensure respect for IHL. This obligation belongs not only to belligerent parties, but to the international community as a whole. In order to be able to exert their influence, third states, the EU, and other regional organizations must know about the IHL violations that occur. Now, we need to acknowledge that a lot is already being done in terms of IHL monitoring by different actors. However, what is notable is that the existing monitoring is not global. Certain contexts or types of violations have been more scrutinized than others. This monitoring is not systematic. Methods of work, objective standards differ considerably. Third, it's not always accessible because the information is scattered, fragmented. So how to fill the gap? Well, we need to be simple and pragmatic. Developing an annual report on the state of IHL in the world would already prove very useful. What is needed is to collect relevant and reliable data, drawing on a variety of sources that is already in the public domain. We need to ensure the veracity of sources. We need also to explore how new technologies, crowdsourcing, social media can complement those data sources. Then we need to analyze this data in a systematic manner, according to the highest academic standards. This requires an advanced knowledge of international humanitarian law. Not every attack causing civilian deaths is an IHL violation. On that basis, we could draft a global report and/or develop a database that would analyze for each conflict credible allegations of IHL violations. We would need to look at alleged violations by all belligerent parties, states, including Western states, and non-state actors. Certainly, this report could not replace proper and comprehensive investigations on the ground. It could not automatically trigger sanctions or else allow identifying individuals as perpetrators. However, this new global report could give good indications of areas of concerns. It would thus facilitate interventions by states, the EU, and serve as an advocacy tool for humanitarian organizations. Who should be involved in this initiative? Well, there is no need to create new bodies, new mechanisms, and organizations. We can rely on existing ones. Actors involved must be independent, non-politicized, neutral. We need also to safeguard the humanitarian space. It is obvious that we cannot request or ask operational aid agencies who have first-hand access to data on potential IHL violations to share this information. This would jeopardize their operations and the safety of their personnel. However, we can and must rely on a network of organizations, practitioners, experts, academics from different parts of the world and in different ways. They can provide complementary experience and expertise, legal, operational, and investigative notably. To conclude, we can improve the monitoring of IHL by developing a global report on the state of IHL that is independent, accurate, and of the highest academic standards. The Geneva Academy stands ready to contribute its expertise to such an independent initiative, which would ultimately enhance the protection of armed conflicts, of victims of armed conflicts. I thank you very much for your attention. Merci pour votre attention.
Gloria Gajoli, thank you very much. Thank you. Let me go to someone online, Gunta Anka, European Disability Forum board member and General Secretary of the Latvian umbrella body for disability organizations. It's called Sustento. Madam Anka, you have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the floor on this very important event. As you said already, I'm living in Latvia and I'm seeing so many Ukrainian people on our streets. And today I want to take the opportunity to talk more about those 2.7 million persons with disabilities who are living in Ukraine at the moment. Those persons and children with disabilities and their families are at grave risk to their lives, their well-being and safety, and particularly we are talking about those who are segregated in institutions. We have the information that about 150,000 Ukrainians with disabilities are arrived to Poland, are arrived to other countries around Ukraine, are around also in my country. I'm a person who are talking with them every day. I'm a person who knows exactly what kind of problems they have. One of the biggest problems is accessibility. The people can't stay just everywhere because accessibility is a really big issue for them. The next problem is coordination. The coordination and information. If the person arrives by train somewhere in Poland, they don't know where to go. They don't know which shelters will be accessible for them. They need help, a real help which could be provided by our countries, by countries of European Union. I'd like to ask European Union, European member states, all stakeholders which are involved here today in our meeting to ensure that humanitarian help which is provided to Ukraine will be provided also for people with disabilities, for women and girls with disabilities, for children in Ukraine, because many of them still are staying at home. Many of them can't go out on the streets to get something, so they need support desperately. I also would like to ask you to work in cooperation with organizations of people with disabilities in Ukraine. And if you think that those organizations are not working anymore, that's not true. I have a list, European Disability Forum have a list of those organizations which still are alive and which still are doing their job on the best way to help people with disabilities. And as a donors, I would like to ensure that the implementing partners in humanitarian activities address the urgent needs of refugees with disabilities, because that is so important for them. And thank you so much for the possibility to be with you tonight.
Gunta Anka, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your patience as well. I'd like now to call Pim Kraan, who's also online, CEO of Save the Children Netherlands. Pim, you have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. This was a very rich and fruitful discussion. Many thanks for the opportunity, Mr. Lenarčič, to say some words from the perspective of Save the Children. In 2022, new as well as protracted conflict continues to threaten children's rights, including their fundamental right to live, to learn and to be protected. Today, we know more children live in conflict than before the COVID-19 pandemic. We are also all aware that children are among the main victims of violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The dramatic situation in the Ukraine And many ongoing conflicts across the world, such as in Syria and Yemen, are ugly reminders that the fight against impunity needs to be intensified. Yet violations and crimes affecting children too often remain invisible in our attempts to fight impunity. In practice, most international accountability mechanisms have been adult-centric and did not prioritize child-sensitive approaches to investigation and documentation. States who bear the principal responsibility to hold the perpetrators to account are not prioritizing accountability for children enough, neither politically nor financially. And partially as a result, these international accountability mechanisms lack the resources, the knowledge to deliver The international accountability mechanisms lack the tools, resources, and mandate to truly seek and deliver accountability for crimes committed against children in conflict. Yet 50% of the world's population is under 18, and many witness the very crimes that are being investigated today. We can't afford to ignore their voices and not hear their testimonies. Save the Children calls on the international community to make sure accountability mechanisms are indeed equipped to incorporate the children's voices, to ensure they themselves are positioned as prime sources of evidence of the crimes committed against them. Thank you very much.
Wim Kraan, dank u wel. Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Manuel Patrouillard, s'il vous plaît, Humanity and Inclusion Global Managing Director. Monsieur Patrouillard, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the final one, and I have just 2 minutes, but I hope that I will have enough time to make a very concrete call for action. For over 6 years now, Handicap International Humanity and Inclusion has been engaged together with the coalition into an advocacy against the use of explosive weapons in populated areas that you have just mentioned. Iraq, Syria, Yemen. In our reports on advocacy campaigns, we have exposed the long list of foreseeable harm caused to civilians' populations as a result of bombs, rockets, artillery, and mortar fire directed at towns and cities. In this long list, let me just come back to the constant proportion of civilian casualties 9 out of 10 in cities, the tragedy of civilians trapped under the shelling, the physical injuries endured, the terror caused by the explosions, the psychological trauma affecting entire communities, the destruction of homes and essential infrastructure, the massive forced displacement, the contamination by explosive remnants of war that will be a danger for decades. Seeing these same consequences now in a country like Ukraine has given the whole of Europe a massive reality check and a brutal wake-up call. In Ukraine, forbidden weapons like cluster munition have been used on many documented attacks at directly targeting civilians. These are clear violations of international humanitarian law. They should be stopped, of course, unanimously condemned, investigated, and sanctioned. But let's face it, some attacks are carried out with perfectly legal weapons towards military targets. Let me just mention some of them. Airstrikes that are supposedly surgical, but that nevertheless spill over into nearby residential areas. Fire from multiple rocket launchers which can cover very large areas. Artillery on mortar fire when the troops are closing in to take control of urban centers. Kharkiv, Kherson, Mariupol, the names of Ukrainian cities now echoes those of Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Aleppo, Raqqa, Mosul, Marib, Sana. I'm going to stop here. The Russian offensive in Ukraine makes our advocacy message, stop bombing civilians, more relevant than ever. Never or nowhere does the use in populated area of explosive weapons with a wide area effect comply with international humanitarian law. When used in towns and cities, these weapons systematically fail to discriminate between combatants and civilians. In Ukraine, of course, the immediate urgency is to obtain a ceasefire and humanitarian access. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas must be stopped. But in order to better prevent those tragedies in the future, our government must commit themselves unequivocally to a political declaration against the use of explosive weapons with wide area effect in populated areas. The last round of negotiation is taking place in 3 weeks from now in Geneva. Only a strong text with massive support from states will prove the determination of the international community to strengthen the protection of civilians in humanitarian and in urban conflicts. Thank you.
Manuel Patrouillard, thank you very much. These collective voices over this whole session hopefully bring home the importance that international humanitarian law needs to be observed. It's helping to hopefully refocus the attention on this and the importance of diplomacy to uphold humanitarian law, as well as making more use of the tools we have and maybe creating new tools as far as monitoring and so forth. How can we do this? Very important. And what's very important too is those of you here and those of you listening, you can help to refocus this attention by hashtag European Humanitarian Forum, because this is not the last of it. There's also tomorrow. There's going to be also different debates and discussions, aid under fire, protecting humanitarian actors and fighting against impunity. That's just one of the discussions we're going to have tomorrow. I'd like to thank the European Commission and also the French presidency of the European Union for making this possible. I'd like to give them a hand, and also the interpreters. Let's give a big hand to the interpreters as well. So my thanks to you as well. My name is Chris Burns. I'll see you next time. Thank you very much. John.